Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Bearable Bull here. And man, do I have this aggressively average content for you today, as this is my first episode of the Aggressively Average podcast. How the elites sunk the Titanic to create the Federal Reserve System and inevitably bring on the Ripple XRP financial system. This is a passion project, something I've been working extremely hard on, and something I'm going to continue to deliver every single week, as the reason for starting this podcast is to shed light about the truth going on in the world. I've done my absolute best to highlight the world agenda for the future financial system, but I also think I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't highlight everything else at play on the world stage. There are many different agendas that lead to the overall takeover of the planet and the world we're heading into. But the financial agenda specifically is something I've been touching for a really long time. I believe it's my purpose in this world to be one of God's messengers, and this podcast is my opportunity to give this message without being neutered or compromised, with the potential of being canceled. Typically, all episodes will always be made available on Rumble and Spotify. But for today, we're not getting into the deep, dark secrets of the world. We're just getting into the history of the Federal Reserve. Not enough people know this specific story. But lucky for all of you, it's not bad enough that YouTube will take me down. I'm really excited to introduce to every single one of you how we got here and where the root of many of the world's problems come from. And I hope all of you join me on this journey, as I've always appreciated all of your support. Now guys, without further ado, let's get into it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it goes without saying that before I can get into this first podcast episode, I have to give credit where credit is due. G. Edward Griffin blew the lid off of this with his famous book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve. And it exposed a lot of the secrets about the initial meeting that took place on Jekyll Island, right outside the state of Georgia, that ensures we all know what the hell happened. Every single one of you need to understand that everything I'm going to discuss in this video is factual, and the only things that are not confirmed will be the intention of people. I cannot confirm anyone's intentions, but I can simply state facts, and you can put the pieces together and come up to your own conclusions. First and foremost, we need to understand that the beginning of the Federal Reserve System took place at the meeting at Jekyll Island from November 20th, 1910 to November 30th. It was a secret gathering on a secluded island called Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia in 1910. And I want every single one of you to pay extremely close attention to the sequence of the years when things go into place, and how there are no coincidences on the world stage. 6 men, Nelson Aldrich, Piot Andrew, Henry Davidson, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, Paul Wahlberg, met at the Jekyll Island Club to write a plan to reform the nation's banking system. In addition, Benjamin Strong, Paul Warburg, J.P. Morgan need to be mentioned as key architects to this. The catalyst for this meeting at Jekyll Island was the Panic of 1907. This was a global financial crisis that was the inspiration and the reason that the Federal Reserve Act was able to get passed. And all of you can do your own deep dives into the Panic of 1907. But for right now, what I want to do is give you the words of G. Edward Griffin himself, discussing who exactly these men were that met that fateful day at Jekyll Island. Please take a listen and learn about the architects of this system.
Over the concentration of financial power that was in the hands of a small group of very powerful and large banks in New York on Wall Street. This is what they called the money trust. That was the name, and it was a very popular expression in the newspapers. And quite a few politicians were elected to office on their campaign promise to break the grip of the money trust. President Wilson was one of those politicians, by the way. So, that was the purpose of the National Monetary Commission, which was to propose legislation, which eventually became the Federal Reserve Act, to break the grip of the money trust over the financial markets of America. Aldrich was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., which means, of course, that eventually he became the grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller, our former vice president. If you remember, his full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, so he derived his middle name from his famous grandfather. The second person at the meeting was Abraham Piatt Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He later became a congressman, but he was very prominent in banking circles. Frank Vanderlip was there. He was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which was the largest and the most powerful of all the banks in the country, representing the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the international investment firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry Davison was there. He was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton was present. He was the president of the First National Bank of New York, which was another one of the giants. Also, there was Benjamin Strong, who was the head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And incidentally, 3 years later, when the Federal Reserve System was finally created, he became the first head of the system. And finally, there was Paul Warburg, who was probably the most important of all the men there because of his knowledge of banking as it was practiced in Europe. Paul Warburg was born in Germany. He eventually became a naturalized American citizen. He was a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And through all the years of his banking in America, he remained in very close contact with his brother, Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Paul Warburg was one of the wealthiest men in the world. And those of you who are Little Orphan Annie fans, you'll remember Daddy Warbucks. Well, Paul Warburg was the real Daddy Warbucks, after whom that character was named. And everyone at the time knew it. I have his photograph in the book. If you'd like to compare his picture to the drawing rendition of Daddy Warbucks, you'll see the similarity between Warbucks and Warburg. And also, while we're on the subject of cartoon characters, anyone who's played Monopoly will remember the drawing of the capitalist with the handlebar mustache and the cigar. That's J.P. Morgan. Those are the 7 men who were on Jekyll Island. And as incredible as it may seem, they represented approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. And these are the men that sat around a table on Jekyll Island and created the Federal Reserve System. What's going on here? Should arouse our curiosity a little bit. It didn't just happen. What's the big deal here? What's wrong with a group of bankers getting together in private and talking about banking or banking legislation? And the answer to that question is provided by Vanderlip himself in the same article. He said, if it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. Why not? Because the purpose of the bill was to break the grip of the money trust. And ladies and gentlemen, it was written by the money trust. It's as simple as that. Had that fact been known from the very beginning, the public would never have accepted it as a means of breaking the grip over the money trust. And we would never have had a Federal Reserve System because the scam would have been exposed from the beginning. This was like having the fox build the hen house and install the security system.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, isn't that a beautiful analogy? Keep that in your minds as we proceed. Now that you know a little bit about the people who were there at Jekyll Island, let's fast forward to one of history's most tragic events. On 1912, the Titanic sunk And here is a list of 10 famous people who died on the Titanic. Here, first off, we have John Astor. He was a German-American millionaire who made his fortune in real estate and was the great-grandson of John Jacob Astor, who founded the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Benjamin Guggenheim, a famous rich passenger, heir to the family's mining business. He initially thought the accident was a minor one, but then the story goes that he changed into his formal evening wear to face death. He wasn't originally supposed to be on the ship, but then, due to technical errors on the other ship he was supposed to be on, he got on the Titanic. Isidor Straus, a German-born co-owner of the Macy's department store in New York, and there were plenty more. But the reason I bring up these three specifically is because these individuals in particular were opposed to the Jekyll Island meeting, were opposed to the Federal Reserve Act and the implementation of the central banking system. These are indisputable facts. And another indisputable fact is J.P. Morgan himself was supposed to be on the Titanic, but the day before, he chose not to go. J.P. Morgan also owned a company who owned the Titanic. These are all also indisputable facts, and I'll let you all make of that what you will. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do here is fast forward in time just a bit. Now that you have a little bit of context with the people that went to Jekyll Island, the sinking of the Titanic, who the people who sunk on the Titanic were, and G. Edward Griffin's analysis of the situation, I'm going to take you to the date when the Senate passes the Federal Reserve Act. The date was December 23rd, 1913, a couple days before Christmas. It was a last-minute bill that was attempted to get pushed through. And this specific act is one of those moments in American history that was so important that we need to look back at what happened the days where it was getting passed. Here, I have a powerful breakdown of what occurred on those days. And I want you all to think and ask yourselves if there's something fishy about how exactly things came together.
And so even the New York Times said, never has legislation of such importance been passed under such circumstances. In other words, the whole Federal Reserve Act was passed through fraud. It was passed more or less while Congress was in Christmas vacation. And so Wilson signed the act into law on December 23rd, practically Christmas Eve, and it became public law. So now that they had a central bank with the power to print all the money they wanted, a privately owned bank, and the Federal Reserve Act itself is an amazing act. It's an act of total monopoly because every word in it, first of all the money that the bankers can print becomes an obligation of the U.S. government, which means the U.S. taxpayer. Second, the stockholders of this private bank included in the legislation that no Federal Reserve Bank stock could ever be bought or sold on any exchange in the world. So in other words, the initial purchasers would own it in perpetuity, which is what happened because the Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Schiffs all bought the original stock in 1914 and have owned it ever since. And they've put it into foundations so it can never be touched. And these foundations are the real government of the United States, Rockefeller Foundation. Nearly all of your major legislation in the United States is prepared by these foundations. And they submit it to Congress, and of course they have enormous staffs and billions of dollars. So they bring the legislation before Congress. And it's impeccable, it's researched and it's phrased and everything is done just right. And so of course the Congress accepts it. And they look around and they say, is anybody objected to any of this? And of course, there's total silence. Nobody objects. So it becomes law. That's why you have laws constantly passed by Congress, which are actively opposed by 85% of the American people. Almost everything is done in Washington. is opposed by 85% of the American people. So you have government by 15%, government by elites. And they're not even Americans. These are international elitists. They have no allegiance whatsoever to the United States. Just like your Canadian legislatures have no allegiance to you. They have no allegiance to Canada. They're part of the international elite. But of course, they don't say this publicly, and the press hails them all as great patriots and dedicated people, selfless individuals. They love that word, selfless. Imagine, all your legislators are selfless. They never have a selfish bone in their body because they're working for you. They want to give you things. And of course, the only purpose they have is to rob you. Not only you, but all 6 billion people in the world, because it's a government robbery. So you have what you call the new economy in the United States, and probably Canada too. And the new economy is simply people working and creating and producing in spite of everything the robbers can do to them. Everything that's accomplished in this country is accomplished in spite of the foundations, in spite of the bankers. People have to work harder to pay the interest. But they do that. They rise to the challenge. At some point, the people will have to make themselves recognized. And they're doing this through the internet. The big question mark is the internet. And that's why Washington has been making frantic efforts to control the internet.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is so much to dissect from that clip. First and foremost, I want to touch on this. Since 1913, we've had what is called a new economy in the United States, where Americans have been forced to fight an uphill battle. We're fighting an uphill battle against the Federal Reserve Act, implemented in 1913, that causes inflation, devalues our purchasing power and our saving power. But not only that, with no coincidences in sight, 1913 was also the exact same year the Federal Income Tax Act and the 16th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was implemented. There are no coincidences. The federal income tax was put into the American financial system along with the Federal Reserve in the exact same year because the income tax is used to pay off the interest on the debt that we print from the Federal Reserve consistently. I know that they say it's for roads. I know that they say it's for programs. I know that it's for the military. All of these things are true at the exact same time, but the original idea in mind was a 1-2 punch of taxing the American citizens and destroying their independent wealth with inflation. That is the goal of this system. The secret death by 1,000 cuts no one was paying attention to because this bill was passed right before Christmas. And the people that could have stopped it died in the sinking of the Titanic. Now, this is where people are going to say, hey, Bull, hey. What are you trying to make of this? Absolutely nothing other than I'm tired of people thinking a sequence of events are coincidence. And this is where I'm going to take you on a little bit of a history lesson when it comes to the Federal Reserve, and specifically with central banks. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to lie to all of you. This next part of this video is referencing a book called The Suppressed History of American Banking, how big banks fought Jackson, killed Lincoln, and caused the Civil War. What's so funny is that this is not the first Federal Reserve central bank that has been implemented in the United States. There have been a total of 3 central banks. And you know what's crazy is that with the birth of each bank and the inevitable abolishing have come assassination attempts. For example, in 1833, Andrew Jackson got rid of the second central bank of the United States. 2 years later, there was an attempt on his life. What's also interesting is how war circulates around the establishment of these central banks. The author of the book revealed how the War of 1812 began after Congress failed to renew a 20-year charter for the central bank. After the War of 1812, the ensuing debt forced Congress to grant the central banking scheme another 20-year charter, and the author explains how this spurred Andrew Jackson, who was fed up with the central banking system and the Rothschilds' control of Congress and the government, to enter politics, become president, and inevitably get rid of the second central bank. He became the only president to ever pay off the national debt. And when the central banking system finally came for its renewal in 1836, he successfully rallied Congress to vote against it. The author explains how, after failing to regain their power politically, the Rothschild banking system plunged the country into the American Civil War. Oh, how interesting is that? Now that, my friends, is speculation, but it is an interesting read for those who are interested. He then shows how Lincoln created a system to allow the United States to flourish on its own money without the need for a central bank, and how this led to his assassination by a supposed Rothschild agent. With Lincoln out of the picture, the Rothschilds were able to wipe out his prosperous monetary system, which plunged the United States into high unemployment and a recession that laid the foundation for the inevitable formation of the Federal Reserve Bank. Isn't it so interesting how around the birth and death of the central banking system, throughout all of the 1800s and even into the 1900s, there was wars and attempts on people's lives? Well, it doesn't just stop there. You're all about to learn why I get so frustrated at people thinking there's coincidences when it comes to the Federal Reserve. Before I get into it, here's a brief clip of what I believe is one of the most important factors that the Fed uses in order to make money and establish power.
A central bank is a group of bankers which have total control of a nation's economy. And they print their own money, print as much as they want to, and it eventually becomes worthless. And I defined in my work that a central bank's principal role is for war finance, because war finance is the most profitable enterprise you can get into. And so if you're a banker, you're looking for the best investment you can make, which is a war.
There are few historians who would challenge the fact that the funding of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War was accomplished by the Mandrake mechanism through the Federal Reserve System. An overview of all wars since the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 suggests that most of them would have been greatly reduced in severity, or perhaps not even fought at all, without fiat money. It is the ability of governments to acquire money without direct taxation that makes modern warfare possible, and a central bank has become the preferred method of accomplishing that. We theorize a strategy dubbed the Rothschild formula, in which the world's money cabal deliberately encourages war as a means of stimulating the profitable production of armaments and keeping nations perpetually in debt. This is not profit-seeking, it is genocide. It is not a trivial matter, therefore, to inquire into the possibility that our elected and non-elected leaders are, in fact, implementing the Rothschild formula today.
You know what, Bull? You had me for a second in this video, but you lost me today. Right here is typically the point I lose a lot of people, especially friends, family, and loved ones, when I discuss the Federal Reserve. And yet, ironically enough, 1914 was the year World War I began. 1 year after the implementation of the Federal Reserve. Isn't that so interesting? The hypothesis that a central bank's principal role is for war finance is something I heavily questioned. I couldn't believe it. But then I thought about it, looked at timelines, and thought to myself, it makes sense. You see, there were central banks implemented around the world, specifically in Europe, before the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. But I believe implementing the Federal Reserve in the United States was the massive chess piece that changed the game forever. Europe was a powerhouse, especially in the 20th century. Something I'll add is that them gaining control of America's financial system through the Fed and externally funding the war in Europe in World War I and then again in World War II, that's a money laundering game that, well, even the finest of scammers couldn't have predicted. Something tells me that when I give you this next piece of information, you guys will all put it together. The Federal Reserve gets implemented in 1913, then World War I breaks out in 1914. Then, from 1939 to 1945, World War II was taking place. And like clockwork, at the exact same time, the creation of the Bretton Woods system took place July 1944. And what you will need to understand is that World War II propelled the world economy out of the Great Depression. That's something you all need to note. At the same time, at the Bretton Woods Agreement, Bretton Woods envisioned an international monetary system. This is what you need to understand. John Maynard Keynes is where these international bodies like the IMF and World Bank get their inspiration from. He called for the creation of a large institution with the resources and authority to step in when imbalances occur. Cough, cough, IMF. This was consistent in his belief that public institutions should be able to intervene in times of crisis. This goes all the way back to the crisis of 1907. That was the initial catalyst for enabling the Federal Reserve Act. The Keynes plan envisioned a global central bank called the Clearing Union, and this bank would issue a new international currency, the Bancor, which would be used to settle international imbalances. Each country would receive a limited line of credit that would prevent it from running a balance of payments deficit, but each country would also be discouraged from running surpluses by having to remit excess Bancor to the Clearing Union. Then, fast forward, as World War II ended in 1945, we also saw that the IMF came into formal existence December 1945. 29 member countries signed its Articles of Agreement, and then the countries agreed to keep their currencies fixed but adjustable within a 1% band to the dollar, and the dollar was fixed to the price of gold at $35 an ounce. Also remember, a decade prior, the confiscation of gold from Americans, and then the repricing of gold that occurred. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, this is something you need to be aware of. When big financial moves happen, there's always a crisis that comes with it. In enters Bretton Woods II. Remember this headline when they stated the second Bretton Woods agreement ended December 9th, 2022. Oh, Saudi accepting one for oil. People forgot, but I'm making sure you remember. We are in the next, and what I believe will be the final stage of the Federal Reserve banking system. The dismantling of the old fiat currency system into the digital currency system. But we need a crisis. Cough, cough. Health crisis. Cough, cough. Lockdowns. And cough, cough. Russia, Ukraine. You see, they've already formulated the narrative, the reason why we need to implement the next generation of this system. But 99% of the population are asleep at the wheel, not paying attention. The BRICS nations have been adding new members to get away from the US dollar, as the past iteration of the global reserve currency is about to be abolished. The new one is waiting in the wings. You know, there's something I hate when it comes to the topics that I discuss, and it's these little semantic games communities like to play. See, in my personal opinion, I believe XRP will be the world's reserve currency. More specifically, the world's neutral bridge asset to bridge all the world's currencies. A lot of people don't like when I say that. But I'm beginning to get to a place where I don't give a fuck. I know what I mean when I speak what I say. And I know why I say the things that come out of my mouth. I do my absolute best to be as accurate as possible with the information I have, with the knowledge I've accumulated from researching history. And if there's one thing I can guarantee to all of you, it's that I'll always bring my best aggressively average effort to the table to make sure that as much truth enters your minds as possible. You don't have to believe anything I say, but all I ask is that you think about it. I think the past and understanding the past helps us predict and anticipate the future. And as we look back in history today at how the Fed potentially came into place and what that means for the future, the next episode of this podcast is going to chime in on what the future holds, why certain agendas are being pushed in the mainstream right now. And we're really going to break the internet with this one. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Bearable Bull here. Thanks for tuning in. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. And I'll be back next week with episode 2.